Chapter 6 Nuts and Bolts of Obedience Training. One way to think about macro criteria setting is to think about what grade the dog is in a given subject. If your dog is in kindergarten or grade 1 on sit stay, he will flunk a test at the grade 12 or PhD level. This is not malice, revenge, spite, or stubbornness, it's just how animals learn. The following sequences for teaching sit stay, down stay, stand, come, heel, don't jump, and don't pull are organized by increasing level of difficulty from kindergarten through to the college and PhD level. Before training any of these, charge up your clicker, conditioned reinforcer, as described above. The detailed sequences in this chapter use prompt fade or prompt drop procedures. For details on training prompt free and later adding clues, there is no better resource I have found than Karen Pryor's Don't Shoot the Dog. Kindergarten sit. Put a treat in the palm of your hand and cover it with your thumb so it stays in. Allow the dog to sniff this goodie. Ascertain if he is targeting the treat by moving your hand around. Does he try to follow the hand? If yes, he is targeting, and you may now proceed to lure a sit. Move the treat slowly over the dog's head, high enough that he must crane his neck back to continue targeting, but not so high that he jumps to target. Move the treat backwards over the dog slightly, maintaining the same height. Then just wait. If the dog jumps or backs up, remove the target for an instant and start over. Most dogs will eventually sit to make it more comfortable to continue targeting the treat. As soon as the dog sits, click and give him the treat. Imagine that the dog is training you to open your hand by sitting. Repeat this 3 or 4 times. The dog should sit with less and less effort from you with the target. Your hand gesture can now be executed quickly with your palm facing up. This paves the way for the hand signal you're about to train. Now, put a morsel of food in your pocket or in your other hand behind your back. You will now use your empty hand as a target by giving a broad, clean, confident hand signal to sit. The hand signal is an upward scoop with palm open. Always conceptualize sit as an attempt to get the dog's head up rather than getting the rear end down. If you get the head up and back, the rear takes care of itself. When the dog sits, immediately click and give him the food reinforcer from your other hand or pocket. This stage is very, very important. It reinforces the notion that the dog's behavior produces the reinforcer and that this does not have anything to do with whether the reinforcer was visible or not as a lure. Our goal, in fact, is for him to learn that not seeing a lure is more predictive of reinforcement than seeing one. It is vitally important that the dog learn the blank hand is better than the one with food in it. For the novice dog, this is like a leap into the unknown. Many initially sit for blank hands in a manner that looks as though they think, well, this couldn't possibly work, but I'll try anyway. You have to make them believers by reliably reinforcing responses to empty-handed signals. This is contrary to the human inclination to dispense reinforcers that are already loaded into hands as lures. This is such a critical juncture in training. Failure to get reliable response with the reinforcer invisible sets you up for a possible lifetime of a dog who only does it when I have food in my hand. Practice until the dog sits as reliably for the empty-handed signal as he did for the original lure. If the dog balks at any stage for the blank hand, don't crack and put food back into it. Simply wait and reinforce the sit when you finally get it. You'll need to train in a low competition environment initially to achieve this. When the response for the blank hand is very snappy, you may tighten the quality control if you like. Select the better sits. This may mean faster, cuter, or neater. It's up to you. When the dog is still sitting enthusiastically exactly as you'd like him to, when in low competition environments, such as at home, go on to the next step. The next step is to do some distraction proofing. Load up a zip-sealed snack bag with 10 or 12 food treats that are a little nicer than what you've been using for the initial installation. Put the bag in your pocket ready to dispense and then go somewhere with the dog. It can be out on the usual walk, on a car errand to the grocery store, at Starbucks while reading the Sunday paper, anywhere except where there are dogs. Hang out at your chosen place until he stops swimming around, sniffing the ground, and checking out the sights and sounds. This might take a couple of minutes or possibly longer. Once he starts checking in with you or looking bored, practice sits with your empty hand signal, reinforcing each one until all your treats are gone. Then go home. Do it again in the same place a day or 2 later. How did he do? Did he offer any sits before you started signaling? Did he get bored with the environment faster? You can also practice cold sits while on his regular walks. Load up your baggie with half a dozen treats and at random times on the walk, signal sit, reinforcing whenever he does it. When he doesn't do it, stop walking and wait until he attends to you. Then try again. Once he sits for the signal, dispense a treat and then continue the walk. This is a double reinforcer. He got a treat and he got you moving again. This exercise is very good for the sit works personal philosophy you're trying to build in him. Although deceptively simple, taking a behavior on the road for location generalization, the practice is gold. Most dogs get pretty sharp after just a couple of outings and can then be worked in progressively more difficult surroundings. You can include any places or contexts you'd like the dog to be responsive in, leaving the heavy competition, dogs and small furries, for later. If you want the dog to be obedient everywhere, practice in as many places as you can. Once you've done some preliminary proofing, it's time to associate the word sit to the behavior by saying sit before you give the hand signal. The word sit is the new part, so it will go first in the sequence. Go back to low distraction to commence this exercise. Proof it in your locations once he's reliably sitting on the verbal cue. Here's the sequence. 1. Verbal cue sit. Wait 1 full second. 2. Hand signal. 3. Dog sits. 4. Click. 5. Hand opens and dog gets reinforced. Be careful to say the verbal sit before you give the hand signal, as opposed to simultaneously as is with most people's inclination. Otherwise, the known cue will block the new cue you are trying to establish. The new cue needs to stand in isolation for a full second before you define its meaning to the dog with the known signal. After reinforcing several in a row this way, try the following. Cue sit verbally and wait, with the food treat behind your back or in your pocket. At first, the dog may simply stand and stare at you, whine, bark, paw at you, or try to target the treat in your pocket or behind your back. Simply ignore all of this and wait for 20 or 30 seconds. If the dog sits at any point, click immediately and then give him a treat from your pocket or hand. Then do it again. Cue the verbal and wait. If the dog does not sit after 20 or 30 seconds, do one reminder review, the verbal cue followed by hand signal and then reinforced when he sits. Then give the verbal cue for sit and try the waiting game again. With this stalemate, you are teaching the dog to attend to the verbal cue. Verbal cues are opportunities the dog will eventually learn not to miss. Remain at this stage of training, reinforcing every response to the verbal cue until the dog sits immediately after every verbal cue to sit. This will fall apart initially when you go cold, giving the verbal cue out of the blue rather than in context of a training session. If you get nothing after a 20-second stalemate, or if you lose him at any point, do one review with verbal followed by hand signal, then repeat with just the verbal. If you get stuck in this pattern, the dog never performs cold for the verbal and always needs the signal review, do the signal review and praise the response without giving food reinforcement. Then give food to reinforce the sit for a verbal cue only. Then make the next trial cool rather than cold. Practice a minute or two after the last successful sit on verbal trial rather than hours or days later, but not immediately after as in a training session. This is a useful gray area between good response in a training session, oh, this is the time when I sit a lot, in real life. What? It is also the one exception to the rapid delivery of trials rule in operant conditioning. Consciously have longer lags between trials for the express purpose of teaching cues. When you get reliable sits on verbal cue, start reinforcing about 50% of the time. This simply means you reinforce about every second time the dog sits on cue. When you do this, by the way, don't do one reinforcer, one skipped in a fixed pattern. Randomize it more. Pick the nicer ones. These nicer ones, your new criteria, will actually be on 100% reinforcement. As soon as the dog is perfect again at this new criteria level, i.e. winner after winner trial, you go down to 50% reinforcement before making it harder with yet some other variation on how you want it done. When all the criteria have been added, you may wish to go for a maintenance schedule lower than 50%. For now, a thin reinforcement schedule is not necessary. The kindergarten sit is harder than you might imagine because although staying is not expected yet, the goal is semi-stimulus control over sit from a stand. In theory, stimulus control means that the dog always sits immediately whenever the verbal cue or hand signal is given. The dog does not sit in the absence of the cue, the dog does not sit when any other cue is given, and the dog does not do any other behavior after the sit cue. In most practical pet dog training, what we're after is that the dog sits immediately whenever the cue is signal is given. As you'll see, there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle, especially when there are a lot of different cues and behaviors to be learned and the context is constantly changing. Dog trainers are like jugglers who have a lot of balls to keep in the air. The best place to start this entire process is by teaching a good, solid sit. At this point, you have a dog who sits on both a hand signal and a verbal cue. Soon we'll add more proofing. That is, we'll strengthen the responses to the sit cue while you increase distractions, vary your orientation to and distance from the dog, and practice inter-cue discrimination. When you proof, you increase reliability. You're teaching the dog that the only ingredient necessary to set up the contingency for sit is the verbal cue or hand signal for sit. You do this by deliberately and systematically varying everything else to prove their irrelevance. A certain location is not necessary, nor is it necessary that the trainer be standing 2 feet away in front of the dog, nor does the dog have to be first standing. All that's needed is for the word or signal for sit. The dog does it anytime, anywhere, no special conditions necessary. The dog can tell the sit cue apart from all the other cues he knows. This is inter-cue discrimination. No matter in what order you throw cues at him, he always gets the sit right immediately on the first try. Until now, you haven't practiced inter-cue discrimination because sit is the only cue your dog knows. Soon, inter-cue discrimination will be one of the balls you must keep in the air. Before we get more into proofing, let's get those other basic cues up and rolling so that we can discuss proofing in a more general context. Kindergarten down. The first order of business, as it was for sit, is to repeatedly obtain and reinforce the behavior of the dog lying down. You could simply hang around and wait for the dog to spontaneously lie down. This avoids the prompt fade baggage. You can also prompt down as follows. Sit on the floor with a treat and bend one of your knees so that your leg makes a tunnel. Once the dog is targeting the treat, you will slowly lure him through the tunnel. He will have to lie down to keep his nose and mouth on the treat. If you're struggling with the mechanics of this, an experienced trainer can show you the nuances. As soon as he is in the down position, click and open your hand so that he wins the treat. Repeat this up to a half a dozen times, and if the dog does not readily target the treat as you move it under your leg, you may be pulling it through too fast. Go slowly, especially for dogs who seem suspicious about crawling under your leg. Let him win a couple of treats for putting his head under before raising the standard to head and shoulders and finally to an actual down. If the dog jumps over your leg to continue targeting on the other side, simply say, "Too bad," and start over again. This behavior will fade if it never works. When the dog is diving readily under your leg to make your hand open, see if he will go down without the tunnel. Many dogs don't even need a tunnel to start with, and you can start them with this exercise. Sit on the floor, no tunnel now, with a treat in your hand. As soon as he's targeting the treat, move it slowly straight down, palm down, between his front paws with your fingers covering the treat so that it is between your hand and the floor. Then just wait. He will probably worry at it, licking, gnawing, pawing at your hand. You are simply waiting for him to lie down. Ignore all other behaviors. They will die if they do not work. Eventually the dog will lie down. Click right away and open your hand, then repeat. The second and third time may still be fairly protracted, but most dogs catch on and very few trials thereafter. The dog is simply becoming more efficient. Worrying at your hand with mouth and paws has never worked, so he more rapidly cuts to the chase and lies down. Lying down, after all, keeps proving to be the best strategy to get that hand to open. Other strategies get ruled out through trial and error. When the dog is instantly lying down as you place your target hand with the treat in it on the floor, you now have the task of dropping the food lure. Before doing this, with a treat in your hand, practice several push-ups using hand signals. Push-ups are sequences of sit down, sit down. If the dog has difficulty moving upwards to a sit from the down position, Simply move your target hand with the treat in it, palm up and back slightly, and then freeze. The dog will pop into a sit sooner or later in order to continue targeting. When he does, you simply click and open your hand again. Don't use your verbal sit cue here, as sit from a down is a whole new ballgame from the sit from a stand you've been working on. Through all of this, the dog is not only learning sit and down, he's learning how to learn. Inexperienced dogs must not only learn which behaviors you want and what the signals for these behaviors are, they must also learn the concept that there is something quite specific that you want at all. Experienced dogs, the ones with great and instant responses to dozens of cues, learn much more rapidly because they know how the game is played. They try out and abandon behavioral strategies in a fast, efficient manner and pick up what the right option is often after the first click. This flies in the face of popular mythology that young dogs learning more rapidly than older dogs. Naive animals of any age learn more slowly than experienced animals of any age. It is prior education that counts, so be patient when working with a neophyte dog. Each bit of training is money in the bank. Once the dog is warmed up by doing brisk push-ups over and over with the target in your hand, reinforce these sit-downs 50% of the time over a set or two. Choose the quickest ones, then remove the target and show the dog your empty hand. Have a treat ready in your other hand. With your empty hand, give your down signal, palm to the floor, the same way you have been doing during the push-ups with the treat. Now wait. If the dog stands, mark the mistake. Too bad. Get him back into a sit and try again. Eventually, perhaps reluctantly, this couldn't possibly work, the dog lies down. Immediately click and treat. Repeat several times so that the trend emerges. Just as for sit for an empty hand, our goal is for the dog to go down as easily for the blank hand as he did for the food lure. When that is happening, you may start to reinforce less often, demanding 2, then 3 or more complete push-ups per reinforcement. Then take your push-ups on the road. When your dog will do smooth push-ups for an empty-handed signal in a few different locations, you are ready to add the word down to these proceedings. Go back to low distraction. Before giving the hand signal, say down and then give the signal as usual. The sequence is 1. Verbal cue down. Wait 1 full second. 2. Hand signal to down. 3. Dog lies down. 4. Click and treat. Your verbal cue will become a reliable predictor of the known signal. After half a dozen repetitions in a row of the sequence, 1 verbal cue, 2 hand signal, 3 correct response, and 4 reinforcement, try giving the verbal cue and simply waiting. As soon as he lies down, immediately click and furnish. Again, the first few trials might be painfully slow, but you must live through this to get to the other side. A dog who reliably lies down for a verbal cue only. If you lose him, give the verbal cue and then hand signal. Try a smaller one, not as low to the ground as you've been giving, and reinforce to get him back in the game. If you haven't lost him but he stares interminably, blinking without a shred of clue what to do, prompt the down with your hand signal and praise, but do not reinforce with food. Then immediately start over. Give the verbal and wait. When the down gets smooth for a verbal cue, take it on the road, giving the slightly nicer road reinforcers every time. Elementary school sit and down. Inter-cue discrimination. Inter-cue discrimination becomes an issue the minute the dog has 2 choices of response. Sit and down. What do you, the trainer, do if you cue down and the dog sits? You have 4 main options. One is to mark the behavior, oh, too bad, and then bail the dog out by cueing down again and reinforcing it when you get it. The second option is to simply mark the behavior, oh, too bad, and pause the training by looking away for a few moments or even walking away briefly before starting the next trial. If the dog is hooked on training as he likely is by this time, this will function as a negative punisher, interruption of opportunities for reinforcement. Only a correct response on the first try gets reinforced. Try harder. The third option is to mark the boo-boo, prompt the correct response, but withhold the reinforcer since the correct response required this extra help. Again, only a correct response on the first cue gets reinforced. The fourth option is to simply wait. No click, no food, no praise, no mark, nothing. Then start another trial after the pause. So which option should you choose? Some are more costly to the dog than others. Knowing what to do in any given circumstance with any given dog is part of the fine art of training. These judgment calls are what separate the adequate from the proficient. Don't apologize about it too much. You'll get better with experience. If you bail the dog out by first marking and then re-cueing the behavior, the dog is likely to guess right on the second or third trial, especially if the discrimination is between only two cues. This is okay for beginner dogs because it gives them another chance with little pressure on them. The game is kept easy to win. The disadvantage is that the incentive to not guess wrong in the future is low. This comes into play when the discrimination task is harder, i.e., when your dog has many responses to choose from rather than just two. With this training style, if the dog gets it wrong, the worst thing that happens is the chance for reinforcement is delayed slightly by having to be re-cued after the mark. The second option is tougher. The mistake is identified as such by the mark. Too bad, but the dog is not given a second chance. The disruption in training delivery is a small timeout. The idea is to motivate the dog to guess more carefully in the future. The stakes are higher. Only correct first guesses are reinforced and thus keep the flow of training going. Use this option for non-novice dogs. Keen dogs that guess a lot, or if no improvement is gained using option 1 over 2 or 3 sessions. If you use it and the dog checks out, you lose him. Go back to the option 1 or crank motivation up and competition down. The third option, to mark the mistake and prompt the right response but withhold the reinforcer, is even tougher. The dog expends calories every time, one way or another, but reinforcement is only given for those responses made on his own by guessing right the first time, as in option 2. If the dog is not keen enough, you will lose him fairly often by training this way. If you're not losing him, this is a nice penalty for guessing. The fourth option, to simply do nothing if the dog guesses wrong, works marvelously with very motivated dogs, but has one drawback. When the animal is on an intermittent schedule, not every correct response is reinforced anyway. Ignoring wrong responses may feel the same to the dog as those unreinforced but correct responses. In early training, this is hard on the learner. For this reason, it is good to praise the dog for the correct responses that go unreinforced so he can tell the difference. Praise helps the dog discriminate between a right response that is unreinforced because of the schedule and a response that is unreinforced because it is wrong. The praise is a signal that the dog is on the right track with that response, whereas the silence means dead end, no way that this will ever be reinforced. The same result can be achieved by marking wrong responses. Too bad, and ignoring correct responses that are part of the schedule. My advice is to experiment with all these communication options and discover what works best for you and your dog. It is good to have a grasp of all these options so that you can switch strategies if necessary during training. All this talk about dog guessing may have you wondering how the dog could possibly need to guess between two easy cues like sit and down. The answer is that although dogs learn the behaviors relatively quickly, getting our semi-stimulus control, i.e. getting dogs to the level where they never guess wrong, is much harder than dog owners imagine. Dogs, when given a cue, typically guess sit, or whatever behavior has received the most reinforcement in the training history to date, cumulative reinforcement, or was blitzed most recently, the latest trick syndrome. Dogs also seem to learn patterns of responses more easily than they learn cues. A classic example of this is a dog who, regardless of what cue is given, performs sit, give a paw, down, roll over in a stereotyped sequence. It is as though the order of events, learnings, overshadows the content of the cues. If you want your dog to learn the actual cues, you must continually vary the sequence and penalize the guessing. It seems to be the policy of many dogs to notice that they have been given a cue, not tune into what the cue is specifically, and proceed to guess their way through their repertoire until they stumble onto what the trainer wants. They approach responding to cues with a carpet bombing mentality, whereas we would prefer neat, precise, smart bomb responses. The only viable explanation for this is that inner cue discrimination is taxing to them. You, the trainer, must therefore provide adequate incentive for the dog to attend to the content of the cues. This is a specific and relatively long-winded training task, especially when the number of responses you have trained piles up. Dogs struggle much more with random order sequences of multiple cues. They get better at it with practice, but only if a standard is set that demands they get each cue right the first time. This means it behooves you to use as tough of a penalty regime for wrong guesses on sit-down discrimination as your dog can tolerate. Every time he gets it right for the verbal, reinforce. Do not go to a 50% schedule for this exercise, even once it starts to look good. Discrimination tasks are bettered by continuous reinforcement. The goal is for the dog to do either a sit or a down for the first verbal cue with no more wrong guesses. Once he can, take it on the road. Now let's get the final position up and running so we can build a three-way cue discrimination, the landmark that, in my opinion, moves a dog out of the novice category. Kindergarten stand. As dogs stand up from a sitting or lying position, they almost invariably take a step or two forward. Your lure and eventually your hand signal will reflect this natural movement. The first step in teaching stand is, as usual, to obtain and reinforce the behavior. To do this without any prompt baggage, you can wait for emitted stands, capture them, and then once they're at very high frequency, add a cue. Here's my favorite modus operandi, a prompt drop procedure. The dog is sitting and you have a food target in your hand. Hold the target to his nose and then move it smoothly away from him in a clean horizontal motion. To target the treat, the dog stands. Reinforce once he stands. Don't let him take more steps than necessary to get from a sit to a stand. If the dog has had any stay training, he might not budge, as it might feel to him like a sit-stay proofing exercise. For these stay-savvy dogs, you must briefly press him to do another strategy shift, back to targeting the lure. There are 3 ways to do this. 1. A body prompt to stand. 2. Bigger lures or extra verbal prompting. Or 3. Simple waiting for the reinforceable response. The body prompt is a gentle finger or two in the dog's groin area, gently lifting upwards. As soon as the dog stands, click and reinforce. Be sure to do the physical prompt after the signal. Usually only a few physical prompts are necessary to let the dog know that this is not a stay exercise. To verbally prompt, try to release your word right after the lure or other encouraging noises to try and get him unlocked from staying. You can also tap your lure hand with your other hand. After a few repetitions, reduce the prompting and wait for the stand after the first lure, reinforcing every instance until it is solidly installed. All this will naturally make a temporary mess of your stay if it's started. Don't panic. The dog will learn to discriminate a stand cue from a sit or down stay and get better at this sort of task in the process. To do this, you may want to oscillate between sit, stay, and stand from a sit trials to improve the dog's discrimination between these 2 cues. Then do the same thing with down stay and stand from a down. If stay has not been started, the stand installation should go without a hitch. Once the dog is standing readily from a sit for a food target, teach him to stand from a down. This is trickier than stand from a sit, but is made easier by the fact that the dog has learned to stand from a sit already. Use the same prompts. When he's standing with great abandon from either a sit or a down, work to obtain this response for a hand signal only, just as you did for sit down. The food lure goes back into your pocket or other hand. You may go back to physical and verbal prompting temporarily if the behavior falls apart. Reinforce every empty-handed stand until he's smooth at this. Then take it onto the road for nicer treats. When the dog performs stand without mistakes or hesitation for an empty-handed signal, cold and in desired locations, you may start installing the verbal cue. You will probably have to signal or prompt quite a few after giving your verbal cue before wearing off these crutches. The sequence is 1. Verbal cue stand. Wait 1 full second. 2. Hand signal and or food lure for stand. 3. Dog stands. 4. Click and treat. Remember that stand from a sit and stand from a down are 2 separate exercises, so work on them separately. When the dog masters the stand with only a verbal cue from either a sit or a down, it's time for the 3-way.